Good morning and welcome to the American Security Project discussion on American competitiveness and national security. We really appreciate each and every one of you being here. Admiral Fallon, recognize you as a member of our board. Thank you for, after a late night, coming and joining us, and the rest of you, appreciate you being here as well. The American Security Project looks at national security as a bipartisan effort that requires both political and the private sector to join together to get a consensus to ensure that we do the right things in terms of our national security. And when we talk about national security, it's not just our military strength. There are other factors that come into it, and one of the biggest ones being our economic vitality. I think we all are concerned about our competitiveness in terms of the global market. And today we have some very renowned people that are going to lead the discussion on that subject. How we'll do today is we'll have a couple of speakers that will provide brief remarks, and then we will open it up after that for questions from the audience. And we hope to be through in about an hour, and we'll move on from there. Our first speaker is former Governor Christine Todd Whitman. She is the former governor of New Jersey. She headed the EPA, and she is a prominent figure in the Republican Party. And we really appreciate her taking the time. She just left an interview with CNN where she was a superstar on that, and we appreciate her making the time to be here. Governor.
Thank you. It's no secret to anyone that we are at a critical period in the United States history. And right now, the fiscal discussion that we're hearing here in Washington, that's the overlie. It's the overhang of everything we do. And it is starting to define the United States. What we're trying to do here at the American Security Project with this report is to lay out a groundwork for those who are approaching these issues and have the responsibility to make the critical decisions, to understand that none of these things happen in a vacuum. It's not the budget over here and everything else over there. It's not that this is just about our national debt. It's about how we are looked at by the rest of the world, the fact that we have dropped from number 1 to number 7 in competitiveness by the World Economic Forum and in 5 years is something about which we should be concerned. The fact that our education system, particularly STEM education, is falling behind the rest of the world, and we're not educating the people that we need to have the intellectual capacity to keep us on the cutting edge of new jobs and new job creation, is part of a national security issue. And that's what really the American Security Project is all about. It's elevating the discussion to the point where giving, frankly, as a former politician, I can say this, giving some cover. You know, sometimes when you talk about whether you're going to do revenue enhancers or you are going to take the other side of it and just try to cut your way to a balanced budget, you get all locked up into the philosophy of Republicans or Democrats. When you step back and say, this is about national security, this is about the true future of our country. As I mentioned this morning, if you didn't get the message after Hurricane Sandy that our infrastructure is in desperate need of attention, because on our farm we didn't have power for almost 2 weeks, and that was a small part of it. We have an incredible need. We are rated way down the list, about 70th on our infrastructure. We have about $1 trillion worth of need. And that's not just roads and bridges. We are talking about the electricity grid. We're talking about the telecommunications ability. Cell phones didn't work after Sandy for a period of time. If you think about what those mean to the long-term national security and what can happen when you have a disruption to those parts of our economy that's a planned disruption, you understand that we are enormously vulnerable. And that's why what this proposal, what this report has done is also lays out some steps to be taken, some things to be considered. For instance, on the infrastructure, calling for an infrastructure bank to help put some money aside to do the kind of investment that we need to do. The drawing attention to the fact that we can't just keep reacting to crises, that we need to plan ahead, that we need to invest more in STEM. Recognizing that our corporate tax structure is one of the high, 35% is the highest in the world. I'm on the board of some companies that would happily repatriate their overseas dollars, but the tax structure doesn't make it economically feasible. And oh, by the way, if you're a publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. So you can't do things that are going, unless we change the way we think. And that's really the essence of the report today, is giving those in public office who are having to make these decisions, particularly at the national level, the kind of fact base and information base that they need to make the decisions that will help ensure that we continue our competitiveness, that we continue to be the greatest nation in the world, which I happen to think we are. But we need to take this seriously, and we need to understand that it starts with us, and it starts with people recognizing the interrelationship, that we can no longer continue to look at issues in silos, that we have to understand that one thing affects the other. If we don't change immigration policy to allow students, the best and the brightest, who come here to stay here, we educate them here and then force them to go back to their home countries, we're doing ourselves a disservice. If we have a tax structure that encourages other people to invest in other countries, we're doing ourselves a disservice. If we don't improve our infrastructure, we're making ourselves enormously vulnerable. That's what this report is all about, and that's what the message we hope to get out. And we want to get it to those decision makers who are the ones who are going to be trying to find the pathways forward, because we are in critical need of that pathway being outlined now today. We can't keep putting it off, and we need to think long-term. We need to change our mindset so we're not looking just at quarters, that we're looking annually, biannually, 5 years down the road, and making those investments, not just in shovel-ready projects when you're talking about infrastructure, but the kinds of projects across the board, not just infrastructure, but across the board, that are going to enhance our competitiveness internationally. With that, I will stop and turn it over to the next speaker.
Our next speaker is Raj Fernando. He is COO and founder of Chopper Technology, a technology trading firm headquartered in Chicago. He's also on the Chicago Board of Trade and an expert on risk management. Raj is also a member of the American Security Projects Board. Raj.
Thank you, General. Thank you, General. Thank you, Governor Whitman. August Cole, who wrote the brief in American Security Project. When I listen to discussions on the future of the U.S. economy, I'm always fascinated to hear people talk about the markets. Leaders around the world seem paralyzed by fear of the markets. In Europe, EU leaders fail to act to reduce Greek debt and fail to create growth here because of a fear of how the market will react. Here, people worry that the quantitative easing and stimulus spending will drive up the cost of U.S. debt and collapse our economy. In the 1990s, President Clinton's political advisor, James Carville, said at the time, "I used to think that if there was reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president or the pope or a 400-hitting baseball player. But now I'd like to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate anybody." Well, I was going to actually do that in a James Carville accent. It wasn't very good, so I spared it. Well, I am a bond trader. I've worked in the financial markets my whole adult life. I run a trading company in Chicago, Chopper Trading, that trades vast quantities in financial products. And the markets aren't an abstract voice to me. And let me tell you something, at least when it comes to this trader. The conventional wisdom is dead wrong. Yes, our debt is a long-term issue. But what really worries me is our failure as a country to invest in our future and make ourselves more competitive. I believe in the American economy not because I think everything is perfect right now, but because we have the ability to fix our own problems. The future is in our own hands. We can learn a lot from history. After World War II, the United States helped create an open international economy to avoid the mistakes of the 1930s. President Truman and Secretary Marshall helped create the IMF and World Bank and rebuilt Europe and Japan. And since then, this American-led global economy has contributed immensely to peace and prosperity in the world. And I want to talk to you this morning about things we need to do as a country to ensure that the United States is as successful in the 21st century as it was in the 20th. First, we need to invest in infrastructure. Second, invest in education. And third, we need to reform our immigration system. At times of economic uncertainty, it's often bold government action that is needed to protect the national economy. And I am confident that the actions that the Fed and the government have taken in the last several years, starting with President Bush and Secretary Paulson's TARP, have not only prevented our country from going into another Great Depression, but allowed us a chance to bounce back from this Great Recession much faster than we otherwise would have been able to do. We need to take advantage of this period of incredible low interest rates to invest in our infrastructure and other nation-building opportunities. This will help us grow our way out of our economic problems, while at the same time reduce the deficit and plant the seeds for future sustainable growth. In my hometown of Chicago, our mayor has stated that the city's water pipes are 90 years old. We know we have to rebuild them. Why wouldn't we do it now with record low interest rates and high unemployment? They have to be replaced at some time. Doing this would create jobs and get the economy moving again. Now, both parties agree that the public sector does not spend money as efficiently as the private sector. Yet government spending, along with private sector investment, is vital for providing this country with the foundation it needs to have a vibrant and growing economy. We know this from the defense industry. We don't rely on the private sector alone for advanced national security research. DARPA, a government agency created in response to Sputnik, plays a major role in our maintaining our technological edge. And they can invest for the long term without needing an immediate return on their investment. It's been so successful, in fact, that even the most strident free market politicians would not abolish DARPA. The same lesson should apply to national infrastructure. Massive long-term infrastructural projects often need government involvement. We cannot burden ourselves with oppressive austerity measures where we will suffer the same fate as Europe. We need to find a bipartisan approach that can help us invest in infrastructure projects like the Chicago water pipes. We need to work together in order to build more efficient intercity transportation, high-speed rail, and smart grids. Why do our Asian and European friends have such better public transportation than we do? Have any of you been to LaGuardia or JFK lately? I mean, we have a choice. The choice is ours. How much did the impact of Hurricane Sandy cost our country? How much would it have cost to build a modern-day seawall? Today, we would not just be building and creating jobs, but we'd be paying pennies on the dollar to do it. By some estimates, the value of spending $1 on preparedness measures can be worth $15 in relief and reconstruction after a disaster. And adopting these proactive projects now make long-term economic sense, and public-private partnerships can provide the financing and will to make them happen. A national infrastructure bank that could marshal private sector funding to help upgrade infrastructure would go a long way to make sure these valuable projects can get the support and the attention that they need. We know we have to eventually rebuild and reinvest, but we must get both parties to work together for this. Our future economic success depends on it. But securing our economic future goes beyond building the bridges and roads that make up our infrastructure. We must invest in the human capital that makes our economy so dynamic. For many reasons, this country attracts the best and brightest students from around the world. Our great universities have huge numbers of foreign students, and a vast percentage of these students often graduate at the top of their class. So what does this tell us? It tells us what we already know. Our K-12 needs to improve. There are far too many examples of bright young American students who are unable to fulfill their potential because they are being let down by an imperfect and overwhelmed school system. We must also greatly improve the standards we expect in math and science so that our students can compete on a global marketplace. Our nation ranks 27th among developed countries in the proportion of college students receiving undergraduate degrees in science and engineering, and we face a projected shortfall of 230,000 qualified advanced degree science, technology, engineering, and math jobs. We must bring our own students up to speed, and investment in education is imperative. And lastly, we must also reform our immigration system. If we're going to educate the brightest foreign students to be the most successful in their field, we want to make sure they stay in this country to apply their skills. These are the job creators. These are the innovators. More than 40% of the 2010 Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. Both parties agree that we should staple an H-1B visa or a green card to everyone's diplomas, but we don't. Tens of thousands of these students cannot get sponsorship and end up leaving our country to compete against us after we've trained them. Many times my own company has been forced to turn down their most promising candidates for job positions based solely on the immigration status. Immigrants to America are faced with navigating a complicated bureaucratic process that is slow and ineffective. We are shooting ourselves in the foot if we turn away the world's brightest. What would have happened if Sergey Brin moved to Canada? One of the biggest companies in the world would not be housed on U.S. soil. Now, I understand immigration is a sensitive issue, but the fact that we are more open than other nations, it's a tremendous asset, and we should give us an enormous advantage as long as we don't squander it, which right now we are. We need to understand that our success in the 21st century will depend in part on the decisions we take on these three issues: infrastructure, education, and immigration. Militarily, the United States is the world's undisputed superpower, with no other nation being powerful enough to be even considered second place. But not all the gravest threats come from foreign armies. History tells us that many past superpowers of the world, the Roman Empire, and more recently the Soviet Union, were not defeated by external threats, but rather their own internal economic failings. America's great strength is its ability to revitalize itself time and time again. There's nothing about today's challenges that are inherently worse than those faced by previous generations of Americans. We are lucky that we know what needs to be done. If we can tackle these problems with the spirit of bipartisanship, there's nothing that will prevent America's future from being even more glorious than its past. Thank you.
Joining the governor and Mr. Fernando answering questions will be August Cole. August is an adjunct fellow here at the American Security Project. He's an expert on defense industry policy and strategy. He's been a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and an editor at MarketWatch. So right now we're ready for your questions. Please raise your hand and be recognized, and we'll proceed. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if the American Security Project is aware of the research on this very subject that's going on right now, headed up by Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School, and if there's some way in which these two efforts can be linked together so that some of the benefit of the research work that's being done there can get into the public policy arena. It's very much along the same lines as what I've just been hearing this morning.
Did everybody hear the question?
That's a great question. I'm actually in the Boston area too, so I should follow that up. We do
A little
little louder. So again, I'm August Cole, and thanks again to ASP for supporting this project. Your question is a great one. The work that they're doing at Harvard Business School on this is a really important step towards raising the awareness of the issue. The report they've done surveys alumni, tens of thousands from HBS, and it's something that has been quite revealing in terms of the way that the business community is looking at this issue in a forward-looking sense. There's a lot of pessimism, for example, that's been revealed by that report. But I appreciate the nudge, and I should reach out to them to see if they are interested in maybe forming some kind of an alliance to raise the debate. It's an extremely important issue, and not just in the unitary sense that competitiveness is something that we can all agree upon is a worthy objective to improve, but it's also about changing the way we think about national security in our country. I think the report does this in a way that allows us to stake out some new ground and getting people to think beyond their usual silos, which are often used when looking at these problems on their own.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Selena Morrow from Radio. I have a question for Mr. Fernando. You mentioned public-private partnerships. It was something that the Blair government very, very much was in favour of for a long time in the UK, but after about a decade we've done some assessments of them, and the assessments have not turned out well really in terms of value to the taxpayer. I wonder if you're aware of this, and if you can talk a little bit more about what you genuinely mean by public-private partnership. You mentioned defence obviously being a good example of that, but I think there's a responsibility of government for defence that is different from other areas.
Sure.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well,
Raj, if you would, I don't think everybody heard that question. Could you repeat that?
Sure. I think the question was really how we can get the public-private partnerships, and the infrastructure bank kind of working. It didn't work so well in Britain, is it?
Yeah.
Well, right now there's so much money sitting on the sideline, and everyone is looking for ways to get yield. And we know, if you take a road that's not that terrible and break it and rebuild it, you might have put some people to work, but you really haven't helped the growth of the country. But if you do infrastructure projects that could maybe intercity rail or intercity transportation or high-speed rail, things that could really help the future of the economy, help the growth, then people could invest getting returns on their investment. I mean, it would start out, I think the goal was maybe 50 billion from the public sector, and then the private sector would go on with multiples of that. But it's all August.
I can follow up in a kind of larger sense too. I think about the way we talk about the goals that private and public partnerships have, and oftentimes the incentives that each party has are not aligned, and that's a political problem as much as it is anything else. And I think that's one of the big challenges in addressing many of these issues, is how do we align people's interests and incentives in ways that are going to give a good outcome not just for taxpayers, but for people that are going to be using whatever is produced, whether it's a submarine in the UK or whether it's a major highway in the Midwest. The way you do that, I think, is something that's not even a technical question. It's more of a one about attitude and one about ambitions. And I think there is a way we talk about the problems we have that isn't high enough. I think we need to have the kind of views towards addressing these issues that really elevate our own aspirations. And I know this sounds a little soft, but I think it's something that is very viable when you consider how toxic a lot of the political discussion is around these really important issues.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Harry Blaney, Center of International Policy. I'm first of all very grateful that this report's come out, but I have to add that for a long, long time, most economists and a lot of very important writers, both here and I would say in the UK, have argued for more infrastructure, for better education of our people, and also at the same time for a rational immigration policy. The problem, it seems to me, is it's not that. That seems to be a way of growing our economy and advancing our technology. But on the other side, it seems to me that what we have at work is and I think Mr. Calder, your answer was very good, is a mentality and attitude that right now most people worry about the debt and don't worry about building the country. And it seems to me in some effective way, it isn't these studies that need so much, because there's lots of studies that are going out there. It's in fact turning that debate in a major way around. And I would like to ask, and the question is, how do we as a nation, not only the American Security Project, but also those who recognize that, change that debate? I disagree with some people who have talked about the fact that Republicans, and I'm grateful for those who, having worked for many of them, who have speaking up on the Republican Party, but they have voted constantly and consistently against stimulus programs that are in fact trying to do the very thing that you're trying to explain. How do we change, one, the attitude of the public, two, how do we change the media's, in effect, constant, what is the word I'm looking for, drone about debt, and the Republican Party statement on that, rather than talking about how to build America? And how are you going about this? How do you think we can change that fundamental element at work?
I think the governor would like to respond to that, but let me say one thing first, is I think that this forum that we're doing here is an indication of ASP's dedication to looking at the long term rather than just being consumed with what's going on in the near term. So thanks for that question, Governor.
Well, I just want to add to that I think that what we're doing here today and with the release of this report is a first step in trying to ensure that we raise the level of debate. But you know, you get back to the politicians. If a politician is, one of the things they do is look at polls. If you look at the most recent poll, it was out yesterday, better than 50% of the American people say, get on with it. We understand there are going to have to be compromises. That is not a dirty word. That consensus can be found. We understand that it's going to take a combination of cutting and raising revenues, and we're ready for that. Now what we have to do is to get people to think in the broader terms. We do shovel ready because, quite frankly, we're part of the problem. How do we always judge our congressional candidates? How do they always run? Did they bring home the bacon? We're going to have to start recognizing that that's part of the problem. I mean, going up to John Boehner's office and taking off your clothes to say that AIDS is the most important thing is a way to get attention. The problem is, and it's difficult, but that's where leadership comes in. And I think, again, looking at this at the poll that you've seen, the American people are ready for leadership. Where someone sits up and said, okay, I get it. I understand that maybe we do have a window in time where we can cure AIDS forever and all. But I've got to look and step back and say, what is going to be in the best interest of the greatest number of people as far as how we're investing our money in the future for development of everything and securing this country and its place in the world. That can happen, but it can only happen when we start to talk about it that way. And that's the whole thrust of this report, is to start getting people to think about a holistic way of approaching these problems. I mean, you heard about Chicago's infrastructure on water. New York City, those pipes were all laid when Abraham Lincoln was president. We were looking, before I left EPA, at $500 billion to $1 trillion just in water infrastructure needs. Well, no one part, and this gets back to the earlier question on public-private partnership, the federal government can't do it alone. State government can't do it, the utility can't do it alone, and the ratepayer can't do it alone. It's going to take everybody. And that's where an infrastructure bank that is given the opportunity to look at these kinds of projects can bring together all the elements and be effective in the long term for the taxpayer, return actually high levels to the taxpayer. But we've got to start somewhere. And right now, here in Washington is the right place to start, I believe, with this report.
August?
Yeah, I think there is another element that we get at even in the title of the report, and that when you step back and look at our competitiveness as a national security issue, it changes the sense of urgency, and it also changes the dialogue that we're having about this very question that you posed. I think a lot of the lack of holistic analysis or even just discussion about the interrelated elements that both Governor Whitman and Mr. Fernando have talked about are a really important element to understanding how I am looking at the problem and how ASP looks at national security in general. I think it is a view in Washington that needs to be adopted more, because the way we project power, the way our power is perceived, importantly, is very different than it was even 10 years ago.
I just want to add that if we have a path toward paying off our debt, and we signal to the markets that both parties are willing to play together and do some sort of a Simpson-Bowles compromise, we don't have to pay it off right now, but we have a path towards it. The markets will be fine. For a myriad of reasons, America right now is one of the best places, if not the best place, to put your money in. Europe is a mess. China is flowing, but let's not make this a race to the bottom, or furthest from the bottom. Let's raise the bar and make it a race to the top. If we get our house in order and get a path, I mean, we can't underestimate the power of growth. We grow by an extra % a year for 4 or 5 years. We just inherited a new German economy inside the United States. That's how vast our economy is. So let's get a path of doing that.
Yes, sir.
Does the board think that part of the problem is the lack of a clearly enunciated vision of where the country has to be? Rather than we need to be better, we have to be something. By 2020, the United States should be X. And the lack of that unifying vision is part of the problem.
Governor, you want to try that one?
That's an interesting question, and I don't purport to speak for the board, because we haven't taken it up that I know of as a question that way. Where do we see the country?
Foreign language, panel. This is a panel will be, I think it's probably better.
We'll get a problem with regional dialectical speech impediments.
I would say a unifying vision is a good thing. Probably what you would see, though, at least from my perspective, is what we are now at the point of doing is stop the slide. Send the signals that we are being serious so that we don't look like we're going to play like a Greece or a Spain or an Italy, that we are serious about dealing with the issues that we have, and that we can actually get together, Republicans and Democrats, to solve and put us on a path to dealing with our deficit issue. But beyond that, what we're trying to do here, and I certainly would applaud it, is to say that it's more than that. That's the overhang. That overhangs everything and overshadows everything. But beyond that, we need to really focus on what are the underpinnings that will keep this country strong. It's not saying we have to be #1 in the world in everything. We're not going to be. We haven't been. The world is changing. But we don't want to keep ceding. We don't want to keep, as was so eloquently put, shoot ourselves in the foot. It's time that we stop that and look at those programs where we can make a difference that will keep us as a great country. Maybe not the American century, that may have been the last century, but we certainly want to be a major part of the 21st century.
Raj,
I think on that note, I mean, when Kennedy said we're going to the moon by the end of the decade, that's a lot harder than anything we face right now, and it's time to start being Americans again. It's time to say, okay, we had the Concorde back in the 70s and 80s. Why don't we have something like that now? It's time to innovate. Why can we build the F-22 but not have cars that the whole world want to buy? I know our auto industry is getting much better, but let's shoot for the moon. All across our country, let's raise the bar. I think the standards have been set too low right now, and it's not where we want to be as a country.
Adam?
First of all, let me congratulate the panel for some good stimulating thought here. Like Raj, so the markets are looking at American junk bonds as the least offensive place to put things. It's going to be pretty troubling. But I've got a question I'd like to pose it to the governor, who has a distinguished career in political leadership. So yesterday I had a chance to be down here in town on panel with a number of our congressional senatorial leaders talking about problems in the world. I thought it was pretty interesting because the questions that were posed, the answers, each of them were in my lexicon of my past holding fire, so they wouldn't quite commit to yes, but the question was posed, what are you going to do about it? Well, not so sure. In New York last night, a lot of business leaders, directors, CEOs, everybody's upset, wringing their hands, unhappy, they're coming to Washington today, they wouldn't feel like that's the bill. But here's the question. There's a growing majority of folks, I think, in this country recognize something needs to be done and do it now. How do we get the political leadership, which isn't dumb, I mean, they hear these polls, how do we get them to get the foot in the water, put the toe in, and get going on any number of things? And there seems to be lots of ways to connect problems. Governor, what do you think? Any suggestions of what make folks actually start thinking about the open?
How do we get everybody talking to one another again and solving problems? One of the things I will say is I don't think we're going to see it in public right now. Right now, what we're going to see in public is everybody's going to start putting their lines of dissent to give them room to negotiate behind the scenes. That's where it's going to have to take place. It's not going to take place in the media. And we're going to continue to be frustrated by what we're hearing. Again, I think it's a really good sign of the people who've walked away from the pledge. You can't possibly negotiate if you've already said, I will not think about this. And, you know, it was one of those things that it always seemed to me mindless to take away an opportunity to do something before you even knew what your problems were, but to swear that you would never, ever, ever raise a tax. It makes no sense. So the fact that you're seeing some of the most prominent Republicans saying, well, guess what? I got to rethink this, is a good sign that behind the scenes there's a wink and a nod there saying, okay, we can get down to some discussions. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I also think, as I mentioned before, with the latest polls showing that the American people are ready for this, politicians read the polls. I'm seeing more right now I'm seeing more movement on the Republican side than on the Democrat side, but I am trusting that that is part of the public persona and the public back and forth and not what's really happening privately. But at the end of the day, it is going to be Speaker Boehner, it's going to be the President, it's going to be Harry Reid, it's going to be the Minority Leader in the Senate and the Minority Leader in the House that are going to have to get together and be willing to stand up to the more extreme elements of their caucuses, and both sides have them, who will draw those lines in the sand and say we're not going to get beyond it. But the leadership is, as you say, they're smart, they wouldn't be where they were if they weren't. And they do read the polls, and the polls are telling them something. Not beyond what you would hope would be the motivation, which is what's in the best interest of the country, based on not what a poll tells me, but on what I know because of where I am. Unfortunately, that hasn't motivated a lot of people much recently, and I am keeping my fingers crossed that what we saw, particularly when Speaker Boehner very early on drew a line and the President then drew a line, my feeling was that they had talked before. They understood where the other one was going to go, and by drawing those lines, they gave themselves maneuver room to come to the center. But it's not going to happen in public.
General, I remember a couple years ago when Evan Bayh left office, he was saying, you know, when his father, who was in office for years, would always have Republicans over, and you know, his early days in the Senate, he'd have a lot of Republican friends, and the last few years, Republicans and Democrats just didn't even say hi to each other, passing the hallway. I think our country is fed up with that and ready to move ahead. And I will say additionally, with this fiscal cliff, I know how to play a game of chicken. You want to wait till the very end, but if we're going to get a 10% or whatever bump after this thing is over, let's do it from where we are now, not break 10 or 15 points first and then get a 10-point bump.
Let me just add one last thing to that point. There actually is the Kennedy School at Harvard is putting on a 2-day seminar for new members, Republicans and Democrats. It used to be that Republicans, new members would caucus together. They'd go through introduction things together. Now they don't. Republicans do their own thing, Democrats, they never meet. I mean, they literally don't know one another. This is an opportunity, and we're trying to work on new members saying, take advantage of this opportunity. Come together, it's talking about issues, the kind of issues you're going to face, but as Republicans and Democrats together. And that's where I think the responsibility comes back on us. We have got to support those members who are willing to reach out to the other side and not let those who say compromise is a dirty word rule the day. And that means we need to support people when they do the right thing as well as go after people who do the wrong thing.
Good discussion. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Libby Lyons from the Department of State and the National Science Foundation. I'm part of an ongoing discussion that's looking at leadership in science and technology as essential to national security. If you look at many of the indicators, we're not only losing leadership, but we're quickly losing market share. So I wanted to ask the panel, you've chosen STEM education as a focal area, but what about the larger issue? That's clearly important, but the larger issue of investments in science and technology by the government, in public-private partnerships, and at our universities, particularly our state universities. I've just come from a meeting a couple of weeks ago of the public and land-grant universities and heard so much about how the states are not investing in universities. That's where our innovation happens. That's where the tech parks are. And so as you focused on STEM education, did you think about this? Do you have comments about how this leadership in science is so important to national security?
Well, August probably should talk about this because the report does go into more than STEM. We just mentioned that as something that people understand. But
yeah, you know, the aim of the report is to look at this kind of a shortfall as a national security issue, because it is. And I think it's something that is addressable as well. It's nice to have things we can look at as problems that have solutions that don't require a moonshot. And this is one of them. In terms of the report's dialogue at its beginning, we focused a lot on STEM for the obvious reasons, but it is inclusive as well of the larger questions of investing in science and technology. You know, as a methodology, we're looking again holistically at different elements, and I think you can place that in the different buckets that we have within the report itself. Defense industrial base is a great example, but so is the infrastructure of the country, because this is no longer a low-tech infrastructure. We will be building roads, certainly, in the next coming decades, but we're also looking at smart grid, we're looking at other science-intensive projects, and so it is, of course, a paramount issue as well, and something the report gets at. But the hope is to start a debate, to get comments like this, to really begin the next round of the dialogue that starts with this report, with this room here, and carries forth. So we should talk afterwards as well. I'd love to do that.
can I just add one thing on that that's, to me, I think is emblematic of the whole putting everything together. We talk about energy and the need to focus on smart grid, need to focus on other sources of energy, nuclear fusion for the future. If you just look at the nuclear energy field, you're going to have the potential retirement of some 35% of the current operators of nuclear reactors. We need to be training the people to take those jobs, whether or not we bring on any new nuclear power at all. And that gets into environment and it gets into climate change, all of which they're all you can't separate one thing out from the other. And we need to start educating people so that our young people are ready for those jobs. And oh, by the way, even if we don't want nuclear in this country, China is doing nuclear. There are 4 AP Westinghouse 1000 plant nuclear reactors being built in China now, supporting over 1,400 jobs in this country. But unless we are educating people to be able to take those jobs, we're going to miss that opportunity. So it's all, the whole part of this is we've got to get people thinking in the circular, that it's not just those up and down silos.
I just wanted to ask, assuming we move
Just a little louder.
Sorry, assuming we move past the fiscal cliff, since that's what you seem to imply, it strikes me that literally the word investment has been demonized in Washington. So following up on an earlier question, and somebody says the word investment, and somebody else says you need wasteful stimulus, right? So how do we move past that idea that investment itself, government investment, is inherently suspicious, and maybe Governor, you mentioned optimism about politicians moving just a second ago. You were on the board of Americans Elect. I took that as an indication that you didn't have great faith in the two-party system, and obviously Americans Elect didn't work out very well, and that's certainly an indication it's very difficult to move past the two-party system and sort of achieve the kind of bipartisan consensus you're talking about. So could you speak to
Sure.
that?
Well, as far as that's concerned, on American Select, for those who don't know, it was the internet, an effort to nominate a bipartisan ticket, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Independent, through using the internet. We had over 450,000 people sign up as delegates. We had 2.5 million people who signed petitions to get us on the ballot, and we were on the ballot in some 35 states, and would have made all 50 had we had a candidate who met our criteria. So, to me, as a first start out of the box, that's a pretty good track record. And while for legal purposes the current entity is going to be dissolved, the idea is going to go forward. And it's not to say the two parties don't work. It's saying what we've got to do is break the logjam of partisanship in Washington. And the idea was that if you have a member of each party in the ticket, so that, as the phrase they use down here goes, you've got a dog in the hunt, each side, you'll be less likely to dig in and say no way, no how when something comes from the executive branch and goes up to the Hill. I do think that there is an ability to do that. There's a desire to do that. Certainly the number of people who followed it on the internet with no advertising, by the way. We didn't have any money to advertise it. All the money that we raised, 90% of it went to getting on the ballot in every state, because every state makes it as difficult as possible for a third party to get on the ballot. So it took a lot of legal work. But I will turn it over to the economic experts to talk about the word investment, but I do believe there's a good way to position that from a political point of view to make a government investment a good one.
Raj?
I'll just say, I talked a little bit earlier about TARP and that it had to be done, and Obama's first stimulus had to be done. I mean, we're looking at the Dow got down to at least 6,500 in March of 2009. And, I think in 2020 hindsight, everyone knows the money wasn't spent as well as it could have. But now that the pressure is off, now that we're in a period that, there's not a catastrophic event going on, let's have a bipartisan approach and find ways to spend money wisely for investment. And there's no reason we can't do, however hard it would be, another stimulus project, bipartisan approach. Not just looking to, maybe break a road and rebuild it, but let's do, let's look at nuclear options. Let's look at other ways we can push this country into the future. And there's a lot of private money on the sideline that, with good ideas, will gladly invest, let alone the rest of the world. I mean, the rest of the world, if we handle this fiscal cliff like adults and show the world that we can play together, money from all over this world will be flooding out into our shores.
I think too that if you look at this notion of investment as being directly tied to growth, I think people buy into the idea of growth, and that is something that I think is not often talked about when we're looking again so much at the ways out of the current economic situation.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Laura Herman with Potomac Communications. My question relates back to this idea of opening to the global marketplace. And I'm thinking about in Chicago, I know the Skyway, there was foreign direct investment there that was very controversial. The Reliance Industry has put tons of money into shale gas. What role, when you talk about an infrastructure bank, you talk about investing in U.S. competitiveness, what role does foreign direct investment play in that?
Yeah, I think FDI is always going to be an important element of our system, of our economy, and I think it's something that we want to always be mindful of. The U.S. is, there's some figures in The Economist recently indicated the U.S. was no longer the top destination for foreign direct investment in the world. China had just usurped that. It wasn't clear if that was going to last through the year, but the point being that I think foreign capital obviously has a place in the U.S., particularly in large projects. As Raj can speak, I think the globalized nature of capital now makes it imperative that we are receptive and can put that money to good use, because an investor has standards, whether they're in Shanghai, whether they're in London or Berlin. I mean, they're not going to want to throw money in America. I think just because we're here, I think we still have an obligation to think about the problem in that financial markets mindset. I think DC, it's easy to lose sight of that. The way people are purchasing treasuries is in fact as a financial instrument, not something beyond that. Even though there are other elements to those deals, when our debt flows to the Pacific, to China and Japan, there are of course dynamics there that are far beyond a conventional bond deal, but at its core, that's what it is.
I'd just like to say that when I left New Jersey as governor, foreign direct investment was the fastest growing part of our economy. So it was enormously important to us because the economy was doing very well at that time. And it was two-way. I mean, foreign direct investment was creating jobs in the state of New Jersey. And then when we did trade missions and took mid and small cap businesses, because that was more important than large cap, they knew what they were doing. They were able to actually come back from a trade mission with a contract, which is not something I ever expected. It was just opening doors because they didn't understand what their potential was. So this is a global economy. We are interdependent and we can use these monies fine. And when people get upset about where foreign direct investment comes, I mean, I can remember when the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center and everybody went, oh my God, they bought Rockefeller Center. Well, Ronald Reagan was right. Let them have it. They can't take it anywhere. They want to develop it. That's great.
Again, thank you all for being here today, and I think we owe the panel a round of applause.